Hello, I am Hashim Ahlbarra and welcome to this edition of Talk to Al Jazeera. Our guest is Mr. Khaled Meshaal, Chief of the Political Bureau of Hamas, the Palestinian Movement for Resistance, which won a landslide majority in the 2006 parliamentary elections, but was soon embroiled in a power struggle with Fatah, led by the President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. Despite a deal that was signed in Saudi Arabia and the National Unity Government that was formed in 2007, calm was short-lived. Bloody confrontations erupted between the two main factions and only came to a halt when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. The recent military blitz on Gaza, in which many civilians were killed, the Israeli threats of a ground invasion and the rocket attacks are all indicators of the very delicate situation in the Palestinian territories. Mr. Khaled Meshaal, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
أهلا بكم.
Mr. Khaled Meshaal, let me start by the new revelations. You probably heard of the Vanity Fair article about a covert plan backed by the Americans to topple Hamas by engineering a civil war and providing weapons to Mohammed Dahlan, who was a former security top advisor to Mr. Mahmoud Abbas. What's your reaction to that?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ما قالته هذه المجلة الأمريكية Vanity Fair.
The report published by Vanity Fair confirms what we've been saying all along, that Hamas's election victory in 2006 angered the US. It came as a surprise to them. The victory not only angered international and regional parties, but also Israel and some domestic parties. As a result, the US adopted this plot known as Contra 3. The name reflects the pattern of American intervention in other people's affairs, whether in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, or Latin America. The US alleges it wants to democratize the region, whilst it seeks to reverse election results, not legally or through polls, but by force, fostering chaos and supporting, financing, and arming the corrupt, and pressuring certain states in the region to accommodate and train them. As a result, the US created, according to this report, a well-trained 15,000-man security force. The US intended to use chaos to undermine the democratically elected government.
That's one part of the story, because Condoleezza Rice in press conference in Cairo said that the Americans also have strong evidences that the Iranians are arming Hamas and providing Hamas with weapons.
إذا كان لدى الإدارة الأمريكية أي دليل فلتوضحه.
If the US has any evidence to prove this, it should present it. The US is well versed in the art of propaganda, fabricating evidence and dishing out accusations. If the US is in possession of a single piece of evidence, let them disclose it to the world and accost Hamas. I listened to Condoleezza Rice's press conference held in Cairo. It was absolutely unjust and demonstrated a pursuit of the same wrongful ideology. The US has made mistakes in the past. It still does and will continue to do so. It's erred when it undermined Hamas for no reason other than winning in the elections. It's also erred when it overturned the Mecca Agreement, simply because Washington doesn't want the Palestinians to live in harmony. Today, the US administration is adamantly in favor of Israel. It says Israel has the right to self-defense, whilst it's Israel that's inflicting death on the Palestinians. After the recent ground incursion in Gaza, Israel declared it withdrew its troops, yet it continued its airstrikes. Innocent civilians are being killed. Damage and destruction is being inflicted. The US has embraced a biased position. As for armament, it is no secret that Israel is armed by the US and other states and manufactures arms itself. Whilst Hamas has simple lightweight weapons manufactured domestically, it may also succeed in obtaining smuggled arms, of which I am unaware as I am not a military person. Our young resistance fighters manufacture simple weapons from their own land and stones. The accusations leveled by Rice are false to justify US support for Israel. Washington alleges that certain states like Iran fund Hamas. This is an absolute lie. Let the US produce evidence to prove this.
Mr. Mishaal, despite all the differences, you have all the time said that you are willing to talk to the Americans directly and that you have no preconditions. So what's the problem? Why don't you think of a better way to communicate in a better way with the Americans?
أولاً للتعبير الدقيق.
To be precise, we're not longing for talks with them, but at the same time, we're not against the idea. There is a big difference between the two. We're not anxious as we do not have any trust in the US administration, but we do not have an inferiority complex towards the US or any other states in the world. However, due to the clear injustice and bias on the part of the US, it is no longer qualified to play a positive role in the region. The question is, why are talks with the US impossible? It is the US administration that has a veto against talks with Hamas. Needless to say, Washington keeps other Palestinian factions and Arab states in the region from promoting internal dialogue. Washington is against Palestinian reconciliation. I state it bluntly through Al Jazeera. I accuse President Bush and the US administration not only of throttling Hamas and Palestinian democracy, but also exerting pressure on Arab states within the region and other Palestinian factions to prevent any Palestinian internal dialogue. Washington promotes civil war and rift among the Palestinians, of course, for the benefit of the Zionist entity.
Condoleezza Rice in Cairo said that Hamas is against the establishment of a Palestinian state. That's why they are not willing to listen to the international community.
This is not true. Hamas is all for the establishment of a Palestinian state. This was clear in the Cairo Agreement of 2005, the National Accord document signed by most factions in 2006, and in the Mecca Agreement of 2007. We all reached a national unity agenda, which is the establishment of a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, including Jerusalem, right of return of refugees, Israeli settlements, and total sovereignty. Who said that Hamas is against the Palestinian state? It is Israel and the US who stand against the establishment of a Palestinian state. Washington seeks a solution that placates Israel, whereby a Palestinian entity is set up with no true sovereignty, whose principal duty is to maintain Israel's security, as desired by Olmert. Hamas, Fatah, and all other factions are for the establishment of the Palestinian state. But what kind of state? A state with no sovereignty? A state on tattered lands? If the UN resolutions are respected, the US should accept a state on the 1967 borders, which is acceptable to the Palestinians and Arab states. Another example is the US's position on the Arab Peace Initiative, which has been proposed since 2002. Saudi Arabia is now angry at the American disregard and Israel's rejection of the initiative. The problem is not among the Palestinians or the Arab states. The problem lies with the Americans and the Israelis.
But there's also a problem. You as Hamas, your own views and visions for a future Palestinian state depend on many delicate issues, controversial issues like the right of the return, refugees, the status of Jerusalem and the settlements. Some of your positions and your views are not very realistic to the international community. Are you ready to give them any concessions?
Are we speaking here of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people? They want us, after accepting a state on the 1967 borders, to give more concessions? What is meant by the right of return? If they respect the right of return, 6 million Palestinians, what is meant by that? What is meant by Jerusalem? What is meant by the 1967 borders? And what is meant by rejection of settlements? Rest assured that the majority of the world, including the Arab and Muslim countries, together with the Palestinian people, are in favor of reason and logic. It is the establishment of a state on the 1967 borders and restoration of our people's rights, as agreed on in the National Unity Agenda and endorsed by the Arab states. The question is, who is standing against Palestinian rights? It is Israel and the US. Israel now vetoes the 1967 border. Israel wants land swap, splitting Jerusalem, even East Jerusalem. Israel wants to restrict the right of return to its own interpretation, to maintain the Israeli settlements. The US, since President Bush's notorious letter of assurance to Ariel Sharon, gave a carte blanche to Sharon. The problem is not in Hamas's vision, which is in agreement with the Arab states and Palestinians, namely holding fast to our rights. Yet if the US sees it impossible without our concessions and wavering of the right of return, 1967 borders, and illegal settlements, what is left for us? In a nutshell, the US wants a people under occupation at home and in exile abroad. This cannot be the answer to the Arab-Israeli conflict. In this fashion, the US provokes more bloodshed in the region. The US and Israeli vision cannot make peace in the region, and we cannot accept peace at the expense of our rights. Hamas, the entire Palestinian people, and Arab states are all for peace, built on justice and equality for our people. ending the occupation and restoring our legitimate rights.
Mr. Khaled Meshaal, are you willing to meet Mr. Mahmoud Abbas?
الحوار الفلسطيني أخي هاشم هو الحل.
Dialogue is the answer. This was the case in the past and it is still the answer today. How, in the light of the war waged against the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza and likewise in the West Bank? I believe that our national responsibility demands that all the Palestinians, Fatah, Hamas and others, engage in a national dialogue where all issues are debated. I'm prepared to meet now, but who is refusing to take part in a meeting? It's known who is, and it is also known who's preventing them from meeting. We responded positively to all the Palestinian and Arab initiatives and will continue. We respect the outcome of Palestinian democracy, the elections, the Palestinian law, and the constitution. We combat corruption, instate reforms, rearrange our own domestic affairs, rebuild security apparatuses and end disorder, establish an internal policy that preserves the rights of our people, and we reinforce democracy. Unfortunately, the US is fighting the very same values it preaches to the world.
But having listened to you, Mr. Khaled Meshaal, recently in your press conference in Damascus and the leadership of Hamas based in Gaza, and having listened to the Mahmoud Abbas, Tayyib Abdurrahim and the leadership of Fatah, I can't see any way where Hamas and Fatah can in the near future talk together about a future plan.
هل تعرف السبب؟ هناك سببان.
Are you aware of the reasons? There are two. The first one is foreign intervention. The number one reason for the Palestinian crisis is outside intervention by Israel and the US, and regrettably by some regional states, to prevent domestic talks. These parties don't wish Hamas to be part of the political fabric, despite the fact that Hamas won a sweeping victory. The second reason is that there is a Palestinian faction that is not in favor of national unity, or a unity government, or the election results, or even democracy for that matter. This faction favors democracy only if it suits them, simply because it is living off the benefits of power and corruption. They don't want a respected faction like Hamas to win grassroots support to fight the corruption in which they indulge, or set an example to the Palestinian people. Thus, our domestic crisis is the victim of outside forces and the corrupt faction inside. Being an English-speaking channel, Al Jazeera should inform the Western public, namely the American, that their governments shelter the corrupt in the Arab region and within Palestine and prevent democracy, which is at odds with Western values.
After the break, Mr. Khaled Meshaal will talk about Hamas and Israel. We will see whether Hamas is willing to talk to the Israelis and what about the long-term truce suggested by the leadership of Hamas.